The webinar will start at 4 p.m. And it's just 4 o'clock now. I wanted to welcome you to Executive Function, the brain's air traffic control system, and this is part 2, working memory. While we wait for a few more people to join in, just wanted to remind you that we are from the Learning Disabilities Association of Iowa. We are an affiliate of the Learning Disabilities Association of America. Our membership is only $55 per year. What a great opportunity to join a state and national organization. We hope you join us. We have a lot of information to cover. It's now 4 o'clock, so I would like to get started. If others join later on, welcome. Okay, this is Executive Function, the brain's air traffic control system, part 2, working memory. This presentation was developed by Darla Stack and myself, Shirley Sennett. We are both current members of the Learning Disabilities Association of Iowa. If you have questions during the webinar, you can type them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. You will receive a survey after the webinar, and that survey will include information about where to find our YouTube channel, and a copy of that link will be sent to you so you can review the recording of this presentation. There will also be a place for you to indicate if you would like to have a participation certificate for viewing the live webinar. Closed captioning will be available in your Zoom settings, and we hope you enjoyed last week's presentation with Amy. She did a great job in sharing some tips on routines, and I hope that you will find some helpful information today in our presentation that you can apply either at home or in your classroom. And don't miss out on next week, organization, and week 4, goal setting, self-talk, and self-monitoring. Also wanted to remind you that a copy of today's PowerPoint notes will be available in the chat, and we'll remind you of that a few times throughout the presentation. To commemorate Learning Disabilities Awareness Month, we are presenting a series of 4 free webinars. And before we get started on our topic of today, working memory, I just wanted to review a little bit about what is executive functioning. Well, executive function is the air traffic control system of the brain. And there are 3 key aspects or components to working memory, or to executive function, excuse me. The first is working memory, the topic of today's presentation. Secondly, inhibitory control. And that just means being able to resist distractions and control your impulses. And thirdly, cognitive flexibility. That means adjusting to different situations and thinking in different ways. Executive function is a term used to describe a whole set of mental processes that link our past experiences or background knowledge to our long-term memory or present actions. We use executive function when we perform such tasks such as planning, organizing, strategizing, or paying attention to or remembering details. Executive function is not a learning disability, but different patterns of weaknesses in executive functioning are present in students with learning disabilities and ADHD. Some of the different signs include organization difficulties, time management, task initiation and completion, focus and attention challenges, memory problems, difficulty with managing emotions, social difficulties, impulsivity and flexibility, poor self-awareness, low self-esteem, difficulty with problem solving, lack of motivation, and relationship problems, and that's a long list. Implications for teachers or parents would be that you're going to know someone who exhibits one or more of these behaviors or symptoms. Doesn't mean that they may have an executive function difficulty, but it's something that you need to be aware of. It's important to identify any students or individuals who display these symptoms because they can benefit from executive function interventions in your classroom. Educators who provide those interventions will be rewarded with improved academic success on their students. And there may also be implications for fewer behavior problems due to less stress, anxiety, or frustration um, because of executive function demands in your classroom and your students' ability to handle those demands. Today we're going to talk about working memory. What is it? Why is it important? What are the signs of working memory difficulties? And how can educators support working memory? Well, what is working memory? Working memory is the brain's temporary workspace. Working memory temporarily holds information in that workspace while simultaneously manipulating the information to complete a task or some other observable behavior. Well, what does that mean? Have you ever Googled your doctor's phone number on your cell phone and then tried to remember the number while dialing it without having to look back? That's an example of how we use our working memory. Being able to hold something in our mind while simultaneously manipulating that information. It's important to note that working memory is limited in both capacity and duration. And typically, duration of working memory is defined in seconds. Working memory capacity is variable from one individual to the next. For example, in your classroom, you may have some students who are able to only follow one simple direction at a time, while others are easily able to follow 2 to 3 step instructions. Working memory can be inconsistent within a student in that they may demonstrate working memory for one task but not another. Let me give you the example of John. John loves science. It's his favorite subject. He talks about science all the time, watches science shows, reads science books, and he has a lot of background information and knowledge about science. But he has very limited skills for writing, things like spelling, letter formation, grammar, punctuation, organizing his ideas in print. So John is able to demonstrate more working memory capacity in science than he does for writing, because much of what he knows in science is already in his long-term memory. As educators, we need to be prepared to identify and address these differences in our classrooms. Working memory has a huge impact on learning, as it acts as the brain's central cognitive control process. It's responsible for things like focusing the mind, directing mental effort, accomplishing tasks, ignoring distractions, inhibiting impulses, and the ability to shift attention when appropriate. And that pretty much sums up everything we ask our students to do in a school day. Working memory is also a strong predictor of academic success, even stronger than some IQ tests. And because of that, it's important for educators to learn how to identify and support working memory difficulties in the classroom. The earlier these problems are identified, the earlier strategies, supports, and adaptations can be provided. And the goal is that students will then independently use and generalize to similar academic tasks. Using working memory strategies and supports and adaptations can benefit all students in the classroom and improve the overall success of the class. Okay, let's use this very simple model as a model for working memory. And I have to give credit to Darla Stack's grandson for helping with this. Think of this keyboard as input. That input could be from any of our senses. It could be visual, auditory, taste, smell, tactile. It could be ability to sustain attention, or it could even come from emotions. The brain filters what is important at the moment, and then sustained attention to that input is what allows us to focus. This is not an observable process as it is internal. Next, that information goes to the working memory processor. Again, this is also not observed because it's an internal process. Remember, earlier I told you that working memory is limited by capacity and duration. If there are too many demands on the working memory processor, or the demands are too complex, the information will be forgotten. It will never make it to long-term memory. The output is the only stage where the unobservable processes of input and working memory processor can be observed. Output represents the end of these unobserved processes. Outcome is observable, and it includes something like you could see a student following a direction or giving a response or making a decision or completing a math problem. Let's take a look at the developmental working memory capacity by age. On the left, you'll see the number or bits of information. And then across the bottom, you'll see some age ranges. This chart happens to show both visual and verbal memory capacity and working memory. For the average person, you can see that working memory capacity increases until about age 16. And I emphasize this is an average. Within your classroom, you will have students with varying levels of working memory capacity. And it maintains until about age 40, 45, and then it gradually decreases. Remember, working memory capacity is variable. Not all will have the same average working memory capacity, and it's also inconsistent within an individual, as in the John example with science and writing. Okay, we are going to do a simple simulation activity requiring you to use your working memory. For the purpose of this simulation, you are all adults between the ages of 25 and 40. So your average working memory capacity is estimated to be about 6 bits of information. Here's your task. There will be 2 steps. You cannot write anything down, and you cannot look at anything. First, say your 10-digit phone number aloud now. Pretty easy. Second, within the next 10 to 20 seconds, say your phone number in reverse from the last number to the first. Do it now. Well, I'm not going to wait the full 10 to 20 seconds, but why do you think this last part, or part 2, was more difficult for you? Well, the task was more difficult because when you first learned your phone number, you used strategies such as chunking numbers together, or visualizing the numbers, or just by repetition or rehearsal or review to help you successfully remember it. Saying your number backwards is a novel task. You don't have that practice and put in your long-term memory. You haven't rehearsed it. You don't have a history of using a strategy for this task. Do you think you would have been successful if I allowed you to write down your phone number and then look at it while reciting the number backwards? Well, of course. Why? Because using strategies and accommodations and adaptations frees up that working memory space. We call that cognitive offloading. Think about implications for your classroom when you present a new concept or routine. Think about your classroom environment. Are there things that are too stimulating or distracting for students? Have I activated my students' prior learning? How complex is the task for my students? Am I giving them enough time to process? Have I taught a routine to simplify this process? What strategies or supports have I provided to help free up that working memory space for students to be more efficient? And that's what we're going to talk about today. How to free up working memory space to help students to be more efficient in their learning. It's our job to assess the working memory demands of the classroom and find ways to dump that cognitive load in order to free up that space in working memory. So, what is the likelihood that you're going to have some students in your classroom with working memory deficits? We know that about 10% of non-disabled students have poor working memory, and that raises to 20 to 50% of students who have learning disability or ADHD. And we know that working memory can also coexist with other types of disabilities. In the next few slides, we're going to look at why educators need to learn more about working memory, how students use working memory, signs of working memory difficulties, and what educators or parents can do. Well, why am I telling you that you need to learn more about working memory? Working memory is a stronger predictor of academic success than some IQ tests are. And the implications are educators can adapt the environment and adapt teaching strategies to help students to compensate for working memory difficulties and make learning more efficient for them. Working memory is a mental workspace for problem solving and is limited by capacity and duration. We can help students to become more efficient by creating working memory friendly supports and classroom environments. Working memory is the central processor that keeps track of information, aids in following instructions, and connects past learning and experiences to new learnings or tasks. It is that manipulation that aids in moving information to the desired output and long-term memory. We talked about the incidence of working memory difficulties in your classroom. 10% of non-disabled and 20 to 50% of students with LD or ADHD. But furthermore, we know that about 80% of students with low working memory skills will struggle in reading and mathematics. We also know about the variability and inconsistencies within students. Within any classroom, just as not all students wear the same size shoe or are the same height, they will not all have the same working memory abilities in terms of capacity and duration. There can be wide variability within a classroom and even inconsistencies within the student depending on the task. Think of the John example and the working memory capacity for science versus writing. And I wanted to share the results of this survey. The Center for Applied Education Research conducted a survey research involving nearly 1,500 educators and their knowledge about working memory. And the following results were obtained. Well, we all know that the duration of working memory is only about 10 to 20 seconds. In this study, nearly 75% of the teachers overestimated the duration of working memory to minutes or even hours. 25% of the teachers overestimated the capacity of working memory, or how much a student could hold in their head at one time while manipulating and simultaneously doing something else. 20% of the teachers could not list a single strategy to help a student with working memory. And even more shocking is 40% of the teachers said they had never used any strategies, supports, or adaptations in their classroom to help students with working memory difficulties. Another researcher by the name of Gathercole found that in the hundreds of students that she studied with poor working memory, Not one had been identified by their teacher as having a working memory problem. Instead, they were identified as behavior problems, inattentive, daydreamers, and poorly focused. So, educators need to learn more about working memory so we can help our students to work smarter, not harder. Let's help make learning more efficient for them. In order to provide effective support strategies or adaptations for poor working memory, we must figure out first where the breakdown is so that we can come up with an appropriate strategy. I've included our working memory model here just for reference. In this example, the output is Sally student has been waving her hand in the air to be called on. When the teacher calls on Sally, Sally forgets what she was going to say. Well, let's look for possible breakdowns first in the input. Maybe Sally was just distracted by another student, or maybe distracted by herself. Maybe she was focused on the teacher's earrings, or maybe she just saw mud on her shoe. Well, a support, adaptation, or strategy might be move Sally closer to the teacher, or the teacher closer to Sally. Move her away from distracting students or the doorway. Maybe the problem was in the working memory processor. Perhaps Sally was still processing her answer to the first question the teacher asked, and when called on, she didn't really hear the second question, so she wasn't ready for it. So a strategy or support for a breakdown in working memory processor might be give Sally advance notice that you're going to call on her, or just give her more time to process. Repeat the question for her. Well, my point is these are two very different types of strategies, supports, or adaptations. It's important that we have to figure out where the breakdown is before we try to implement any kind of support strategy or adaptations. This is one of my personal favorites. The output or observable behavior is when you ask me what you are supposed to do after I just finished giving directions. Well, a possible input breakdown in this student was maybe they didn't hear the teacher, maybe they couldn't see what the teacher was writing on the board. So an input strategy support adaptation might be move closer to the speaker or move them closer to the board to see instructions. Perhaps it was a breakdown in the working memory processor. Maybe this student just had too many instructions going on at once. Or maybe this was just a novel task for this student. They had no experience with it. Maybe the student just couldn't find their materials, or maybe they were just overloaded, too much going on in their brain. So a working memory processor breakdown support might be break things down into smaller chunks. Help the student to make connections with previous learning. What does a student already know that they can use to lift off some of that cognitive load? Maybe the student needs to learn a procedure or a routine, so the task isn't so complicated the next time. Again, the supports and strategies will only work if we figure out first where the breakdown is. Here's another scenario. The output. This student turned in their test without finishing it. Well, a possible input breakdown might be this student looked around and saw everybody else turning in their tests, so they quick turned in theirs. Or maybe it was recess time and they just wanted to go out for recess. So an input strategy or support might be talk to the student about asking for extended time to complete the test, or spread the test out over multiple settings. And don't take away recess for our slow processors. Perhaps it was a working memory breakdown, working memory processor breakdown. Maybe the student was just overwhelmed by all of the information tasks on the test. The test paper appeared cluttered to them, and it was hard for them to figure out one part versus another. So a strategy might be enlarging the print, or putting a box around different sections, or even cutting the paper in half. Again, work smarter, not harder, to find the breakdown first and then appropriate supports and strategies. I think I'm going to skip this one just to save some time for Q&A. Okay, to review, what does research tell us about working memory? Well, we're going to shift gears here from the model and talk about the research. More research on working memory is needed, but we know the best interventions are the ones that are done in the context of the classroom task or activity, rather than any kind of separate computer memory training program. Why? Because students are more likely then to generalize to similar other academic tasks. We also know there is no cure for working memory. It's just the way your brain is wired. But there are certainly a number of things that we can do to help the student to compensate for those weaknesses. We know, research tells us, that when educators can structure the environment and adapt the instruction in a way that is mindful of working memory demands of the task, students will demonstrate academic success. So how do students use working memory in the classroom? They use it all the time for just about everything you can think of. Students use working memory for completing tasks, remembering the steps, requirements of an assignment, or a set of the verbal directions that the teacher gave. They use it in reading comprehension, remembering characters, events, details, setting, plot. In written language, students are simultaneously required to remember how to form letters, spell, remember word order in a sentence, and organization of a paragraph. Math requires mental computation and problem solving, remembering steps, formulas, procedures, and using multiple steps to solve word problems. Note-taking is another example of when we use working memory in the classroom. Students must simultaneously remember ideas while formulating and writing down the notes. Copying from the board can be a challenge for students with poor working memory processing. You can see those students look up, retain just a few words or letters, look down and write, look up, look down, where students who have stronger working memory capacity or skills will be able to look at multiple things at once, remember, and make notes. We also use working memory for following directions, remembering detailed directions while performing other tasks. Think of the student who remembers the last thing that you said, but not the first, so they don't have any idea of what they're supposed to do. And even responding to oral questions in class, being able to remember what the question was, all parts of the questions, formulating your response, and then verbally responding. Let's help students work smarter, not harder, making learning more efficient for them. And we can do that by structuring the environment and adjusting teaching strategies. Being mindful of tasks that create heavy demands on working memory, and where possible, provide appropriate supports and strategies. Excuse me. This could be a long day if I keep getting hoarse. We'll see. All right, this is a 7-step process for supporting working memory in the classroom. And I give credit to Chad, children and adults with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Step 1, recognize students who are having working memory difficulties. We talked a little bit about some of the symptoms of executive function difficulties. Many of those are similar. Working memory difficulties are often misidentified, as I said earlier, as behavior problems. Have you known a student who exhibited behaviors or the output, such as the one in the scenarios I shared, like Sally raising her hand and then not knowing what to do, or the student who turned in half their work. Did you view these as a working memory problem, or did you view this as a behavior problem? Good question to ask yourself. Remember Gather Cole's study of the hundreds of students with working memory difficulties, and when she interviewed teachers, not one single teacher identified the students as having a working memory problem. Instead, they were called inattentive, daydreamers, and poorly focused. If we can identify those students with working memory problems and create working learning environments to reduce cognitive load while teaching appropriate strategies and supports, then our students will have increased academic success and likely improved behavior. We can help students to work smarter, not harder, and more efficiently. Step 2, monitor and interview the student. Educators have to use observation and interview to figure out where the possible working memory breakdowns exist. Is it in the input, as we talked about earlier, or is it a breakdown in the working memory processor? Here's an example of a student who has shut down and stopped working. And rather than correcting this student or saying, get back to work, the educator takes the time to figure out the breakdown. A good question you might start out with is, what do you know about? What do you know how to do? And what do you need help with? And I like this question because it helps to activate prior learning or background information or what the student already has in their long-term memory. That will help free up space in the working memory processor. Some students, however, might not be able to answer that question, so you'll need to follow up with other questions. You want to make enough observations and ask enough questions to guide you in figuring out where the breakdown is. Again, knowing where the breakdown is will lead us to determining the kind of adaptations or supports that student will need. Step 3, evaluate the working memory demands of your classroom. Well, what are some of the demands? You can ask yourself questions such as, what do my students already know about this? Is the information communicated in the simplest, concise terms? Are there any significant demands on working memory? Well, you need to identify tasks that are likely to exceed a student's working memory capacity. And we do that by looking at 3 components. The first one is length. In the absence of supports, the longer the task and the more steps necessary for its successful completion, the less likely a student is to be successful. A student with poor working memory is to be successful. Unfamiliar or non-meaningful content. When having to hold an unfamiliar or non-meaningful information in mind, students cannot draw upon previous knowledge as a tool to support working memory. Familiar or meaningful information is much easier to temporarily keep in our mental workspace. Think of the simulation when I asked you to tell me your phone number and then to say your phone number backwards. You did not have that backwards number in your long-term memory, and it made the task much more difficult for you. And thirdly, a demanding mental processing activity. Whenever a child is asked to perform a challenging mental activity while simultaneously holding on to information, working memory capacity becomes more of an issue. Well, how do you reduce working memory load? Step 4, reduce working memory load. Remember, there is no cure for working memory. It is how our brains are wired, so we need to adapt the task. down into smaller chunks or more manageable chunks at a time. If a longer assignment or project is given, break it down. Give instructions for just one part at a time and then follow up with the student to make sure they understand what they're doing before giving the next set of directions for the project. Increase the meaningfulness of the material. You can do this by, very importantly, activate prior learning. Before introducing something new, help students recall what they already know. Can do it through maybe a class discussion, a quiz, brainstorming. It's important to use phrases such as this to activate prior learning. Remember when we talked about, and have a discussion with your students. Or this reminds me of, and have that discussion. Make it relevant. Give real-world examples of how students can use this in their current or future lives, and allow opportunities for students to choose topics of interest to them whenever doing a project or writing a paper. And don't forget about active learning. Activities are likely to engage the learner, and that could include hands-on activities, discussions, group works, art, drama, music, and so on. Simplifying the amount of mental processing or mental effort required for a task, making it easier for individuals to learn, understand, and perform. And you can do that in various ways, including provide a quiet environment, one that is organized and neat, not cluttered, minimize interruptions. Use graphic organizers, checklists, charts, word banks, math fact tables. Don't forget about technology, voice to text, audiobooks, word predict software, scanners, reduce copying. And just provide a structured environment with predictable routines and procedures. All of the things that Amy talked about last week. You can do it by restructuring complex tasks. Break complex tasks down into more manageable subtasks. Identify the steps required and then arrange them in a logical sequence. And again, use visuals to help the students. Step 5. Be prepared to repeat. Students with poor working memory benefit from information being repeated, visual reminders of steps, peer helpers, and follow-up and frequent check-ins from the teacher. Step 6, encourage the use of memory aids. I think we had a question about strategies for memory, and this would be a good slide for you to refer to. There are lots of different memory aids that we can use, including visuals, which include a number of things, graphic organizers, timelines, concept maps, mind maps, number lines, word banks, math facts charts, or other templates. There could be organizational tools, and Jess will talk about this next week in week 3. Calendars, planners, to-do lists, checklists, color coding, one of my favorites. The use of mnemonics, and I'll talk more about that in a bit, and then those technology aids. And for you, I have added 2 free resources here for graphic organizers and a third for memory and mnemonic examples. Step 7, develop the student's use of strategies supporting working memory. Well, last week, Amy told us that the biggest mistake we can make when teaching a strategy to students, whether it be for a procedure, a routine, an academic task, is that we expect and assume that students know how, when, where, why, and when to use it. I think I said when twice. Proper strategy instruction is important, and it includes explicit instruction. Teach the student those specific steps of a strategy and also discuss the how, when, where, and why to use it. Teacher modeling, very important. Demonstrate while thinking aloud how the strategy is used and do that repeatedly. Guided practice provides ample opportunities for students to practice a strategy, making sure that they still get some guidance and corrective feedback from the teacher. And that leads to independent practice, which just is another opportunity for students to independently work while the teacher continues to monitor and provide feedback or corrective feedback. The next step is self-regulation and self-monitoring and goal setting. And Kim Miller will be talking about that in week 4, so don't miss out. We need to encourage students to be self-directed in their learning by teaching them to use strategies such as self-monitoring and goal setting. And finally, maintenance and generalization. Incorporate activities to encourage students to continue to use the strategy and use it in other similar tasks. Okay, those are the 7 steps. Now we're going to focus on what can teachers do or what can parents do. And I'll be talking about these general strategies and supports for working memory. We know that more research is ongoing in the field of working memory, and that working memory training, like a separate computer program, really doesn't generalize well. But there are ways to support students with compensatory strategies and supports. And the next slides will provide examples of those in the classroom. And note that I have provided links at the bottom of each slide so you can do further research. Okay, first one, very important, reduce working memory load. And you can do that in a number of ways. Chunking, we talked about that already. One task at a time, or one part at a time, or one direction at a time. Reduce the length or amount of work. That will help free up space in your working memory processor. When new information is provided or introduced, be sure to be brief, concise, and to the point. Eliminate any extra verbiage that may confuse the student. Provide information in multiple ways: verbal, auditory, visual. Provide verbal cues and keywords. Important. During the lesson, listen to the students talk about important words or ask them about key vocabulary concepts and post those, refer back to them frequently. Pair verbal directions with a written copy. Some of our students need that to-do list, step 1, step 2, step 3, written on a sticky note on their desktop. Provide opportunities that will help increase interest in the tasks by providing hands-on activities and the use of manipulatives. And finally, do what Amy said last week. Develop routines and procedures and use them and practice them repeatedly. All of these strategies will help to reduce the cognitive load in working memory. Repeat and review. Be prepared to repeat information. Use lots and lots of visuals, visual reminders, checklists, to-do lists, steps. Provide opportunities for students to rehearse and repeat. And remember that spaced practice is more effective than massed practice. Advanced organizers. This is a big one. Advanced organizers give students the broad idea of what the lesson will be about before the lesson begins. For example, a teacher may tell the students, for example, we've talked about habitats and why different animals live in different places from other animals. And we also talked about the 4 layers of the tropical rainforest and which animals live in each part of the layers. Today we're going to talk more about where these animals live. Another example might involve storytelling as an advanced organizer. The teacher might, at the beginning of the class, say, I'm going to tell you an interesting story that relates to important concepts in the lesson. I'm going to tell you a story about a little tree frog who climbed to the very top from the forest floor to the very top of the tallest tree in the rainforest. Skimming is another example. A teacher may ask the students to skim over a passage, focusing on highlighted information such as captions or chapter headings. And that just helps to make them more familiar with the material before they read it more thoroughly. For younger students, the teacher might ask them to do a picture walk through the reading. Graphic organizers are great. I love them. I use them all the time. They help structure information visually or in pictures. They're usually a one-page form with lots of space or areas, so it's easy for students to skim over them. And here's an example for this rainforest example. A teacher might give the students a simple drawing of a tree with lines marking each of the 4 levels of the rainforest. And as the lesson goes on, students can then fill in the graphic organizer with the names of different animals that live in the different layers in the rainforest. Another example of a KWL is a KWL chart. Divide your paper in 3 columns, and in the first column, write what you know, the second column, what I want to know, and finally, what I have learned. Strategies and supports teach step-by-step strategies, and this is just a sort of a repeat of the strategy instruction I talked about earlier, but I wanted to point out teach one strategy at a time. Make sure that is in their long-term memory. They have independently been able to use it before teaching a new one. Teach students when, where, why, and how to use the strategy. Amy emphasized that last week. Encourage the use of memory aids. I know we had a question about memory aids. Use all kinds of visuals, posters and charts, word walls. Directions or steps with instructions should be given both in visual or auditory modalities. Use a whiteboard, a handout, a sticky note, and remember, some students just need a desk copy. Checklists for multiple step tasks. Graphic organizers. Pair pictures or hands-on activities with verbal information. And don't forget rhymes, songs, and movements and patterns. Or technology tools such as a calculator, word processor, spell check, grammar check, text readers, or voice to text. This would be a good time to remind you, if you haven't already done so, put your questions in the Q&A, and also be sure to check out the chat, because there you will find the PowerPoint notes for this presentation. Pause, paraphrase, summarize, and allow time. Research tells us that 40% of total learning needs to be spent reviewing new materials. So students are more likely to hear and remember if they hear their own voice or a peer's voice. Allow extra time for rehearsal and processing, and also extra time to retrieve information. As in that Sally example, let Sally know that you're going to ask her the next question so she knows how to prepare and can be ready. And consider this, for students who have significant working memory issues, avoid open-ended questions. Use more of a structured response format to help them reduce the cognitive demands in their working memory processor. And get physical. Active participation, using multiple modalities, moving around, manipulatives, hands-on activities, and don't forget games, drama, and art to reinforce concepts. Color coding, one of my favorite things to do, and I'm sure Jess will talk about this next week in organization, but use color coding to separate, organize folders by subjects. This is an example of using color coding for parts of speech, and even highlighting similar word patterns. Very important, make overt links to prior knowledge and use keywords. Activating prior knowledge helps to reduce that cognitive load to free up space in your working memory processor. Encourage drawing, writing, and verbal reflection. Start each lesson with a quick review of the previous lesson and write down those important key vocabulary words or trigger words as the students recall the information. Teach the students to listen for those key words and post them and use them frequently. Model that as a teacher. And always, always end each lesson with a summary of what was learned. Memory aids. I believe someone else asked about memory aids. Well, research has shown that the use of mnemonics is a very effective strategy for remembering factual information or to remember essential steps or important information. And there are different kinds of them, but I listed a few here and I'm sure you're familiar with them. HOLMES is the acronym for the Great Lakes. And who doesn't know Every Good Boy Does Fine, the acrostic for remembering the treble clef, or Roy G. Biv for the rainbow. Graphic organizers are another tool for helping with organizing and remembering information. And here are some examples that are available for free through the Iowa Reading Research Center. It's a great resource for you, and I encourage you to use this link and check it out. Don't reinvent the wheel if they already have it for you. Okay, as I said earlier, we end every lesson with what have we learned? So what have we learned? Well, we learned about the model of working memory. We know that input and working memory processing are unobserved processes, and output is the only step in that model that is observed. I told you it's important to figure out where the breakdown exists. Is it in input or working memory processing before we set up our strategy, support, or adaptation? Why? Because we need to match the breakdown to the solution. We also learned that working memory is limited in capacity. And we talked about a very wide range in working memory capacity within your classroom. We even talked about inconsistency within a student, as in the John example with science and writing. We learned that on average, working memory continues to rise until about age 16 and starts declining around age 45. But again, those are averages and you can have a lot of variability within your classroom. We learned this fact. According to the Gather-Cole survey, the majority of teachers will misidentify working memory problems as a behavior problem. We also learned that working memory is a strong predictor of academic success. And if we start early with providing those structures, supports, adaptations, students will have higher academic success rates, and they will be more likely to become independent in generalizing those to other similar tasks. We also learned that working memory has many different signs. We know that they can be observed across all subject areas, and that about 10% of non-disabled students will demonstrate working memory difficulties, and that number rises to 20 to 50% of individuals who have other disabilities or learning disabilities or attention deficit disorder. We learned you don't just throw out interventions or supports or even accommodations. We must thoughtfully determine where the breakdown is through observations and interviews, and then adapt instruction and provide the appropriate supports, structures, and strategies. We learned, that there is no cure. Memory training does not generalize well. Teachers need to provide those adaptations, instructional strategies, and supports to help students with poor working memory to compensate for those deficits. There is no cure. And teachers will be rewarded with improved academic success and achievement scores and improved behavior. As Amy said last week, classrooms that have procedures and routines that are clear, consistent, predictable, and have student input or involvement result in improved learning and behavior. Why? Because having these routines and procedures solidly ingrained in our long-term memory helps to free up those spaces in our working memory processor. And don't forget the power of activating prior knowledge and learning at the beginning of class and reviewing what has been learned at the end of your class. Be sure to join us next week as we talk about organization, and week 4 as we talk about goal setting, self-talk, and self-monitoring. Thank you, teachers, for making a difference. And we have some time now. Oh, before we go to Q&A, I have a few slides to show you. Sorry, I forgot about that. This is a very important one. This is information about LDA Iowa. And it has all of our website, social media, our YouTube channel, where you will be able to find videos of our webinars, plus more. If you need to contact us, there's our email, and we want you to join us. And you can go to this link to join or become a member. I also have listed here for your reference the sources that Darla, Stack, and I use for this presentation. There's several pages of those. And I ended with free graphic organizers and the mnemonic devices or examples. So with that, I will check with Kim to see, do we have any questions in our Q&A, Kim?
We do, Shirley, and I'm going to give the one that is in there right now, and then I'll come back to some we saw ahead of time. But
Okay.
a person's asking right now, do you have any specific examples of skills to use as I teach Spanish? I teach Spanish 1 and 2 at a high school.
Sure. I mean, go back to all of those strategies after the 7 steps in my presentation, using visuals and supports. My daughter-in-law happens to be a Spanish teacher, and she has all kinds of visual supports throughout her classroom to help students with that. Um, labeling everything within your classroom with the correct Spanish word or terminology for it. Using graphic organizers, any kind of visual supports, I would highly recommend.
Thanks, Shirley. Now, this next one, I'm lumping some of these together because I'd say these questions are pretty similar. What are the most effective strategies for improving working memory? How can parents help with working memory? How can schools help? And what do I do with smart but scattered students who can't hold information in working memory related to a task or holding on to part of directions?
Okay, I'm just going to remind you all there is no cure for working memory. It's how we are wired. So our job is to find ways to help students to compensate for those deficits. And I would go back to my presentation on the 7 steps for supporting working memory and looking at the examples after that I gave for how to adapt in your classroom to structure the environment to help reduce that cognitive load. Um, Try to reduce those demands when possible, and just by providing appropriate supports and structures. An example would be think about when you have a 2-factor authentication code on your cell phone and you're have to put in that number before you can log into your account. And I can't do it without writing it down because I have to look back and close a window and do it again. We need to provide those kind of visual aids and supports for students too. If it's something that we think they'll have trouble remembering, give them cues. In math, give them formula notes or procedure notes. Any kind of hurdle help where we can visually support the student so they can independently use that adaptation will be profitable. And I really like the idea of giving the student the responsibility, once we have taught them the strategy, to become more independent in using those tools.
Thanks, Shirley. Here's a very specific one. A parent wanted to know, how do I support a child in telling a narrative that happened to them? And then they have to go to school and they have to be able to then either write out the narrative or be able to tell it in a sequence.
Okay. Well, there are a couple things you could do at home. Have the student dictate that story to you, and maybe you could write it down in outline form, or, this happened first, then this, then next, and how it ended. The student can record themselves telling it, and listen to it several times to help them remember. Although I do think a visual support would be better. Um, Teachers provide graphic organizers for how to write a narrative story. And if your teacher didn't give you one, you can ask for it. And if not, Google it. How to write a narrative paragraph. And there are many examples online that would be very helpful.
Finally, Shirley, to wrap it up, several questions about, do students need to have an IEP or 504 to receive working memory strategies and supports in the classroom?
No, they don't need to. A lot of the things that we talked about, that Amy talked about, and that you and Jess will be talking about, are just components of good, solid teaching. And so, no, you don't need to have an IEP. You don't need to have a 504 or even a formal evaluation saying that you have a working memory deficit. This is just good strategy and teaching. So, think of it this way. Do you want to increase test scores in your class? Do you want to improve behavior of your students? Do you want to increase the overall success of your students? These are good strategies to implement that will benefit all students. Now, I will say some students do have an IEP or a 504 with exact or specific accommodations or supports listed in those documents. And in that case, teachers must be aware and follow those steps.
Well, thank you so much, Shirley. We have several comments in here thanking you for all of your information and your great resources.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to do it. And I just have to put in one more plug. Join LDA. We need you more than ever. If you're worried about the status of supports for individuals with disabilities in Iowa, I strongly recommend that you join our group. We're glad to have you. Thank you.